This event was started in 2001 by 4 people, myself and the 3 other members of the San Jacinto Historical Advisory Board at that time, which were myself, Nina Hendy, Bill Connor, and Jan DeVault. And we did this as an experiment to see if, in addition to the official ceremony for San Jacinto Day, whether there would be an interest in Houston to have an event such as this that would be devoted to an all-day event on Texas history, and in particular focusing on the Battle of San Jacinto and the Texas Revolution and Republic period. It exceeded our best expectations. Since then, we have had over 1,700 registered guests to our symposium since the first one. We brought in over 40 outstanding scholars from all over Texas, many states, and Mexico. And today we had another scholar from Mexico and a new country with Scotland or UK. And we're very pleased to have a great lineup of speakers for today. Also, one of the exciting things that we've implemented for our symposium is the offering of professional education credits for school teachers. And this year we had 41 school teachers registered. I'd like for each of you to raise your hands. I'd like to recognize you. And thank you very much. Right. Thank you very much for coming, and also for your work in teaching our kids about Texas history and the exciting things that we have to know about our great history of our state. Also, we have some very special financial sponsors I'd like to recognize. These are the Summerlee Foundation, Humanities Texas, which is the state affiliate of the National Endowment for the Humanities, Sterling Bank, and also Compass Charity. We'd like to thank each of those entities for their financial support for the symposium. Now, before starting, I'd like to tell you a little bit about the Friends of the San Jacinto Battleground. This event is organized by a committee, call it the Symposium Committee, which is composed entirely of volunteers. The chairman of the committee is Dave Britton, and there are about 25 or so volunteers whose names are in the program, and I'd like to thank each and every one of them for their work in putting this on. It's amazing that each year we're able to do this without any paid employees at all. So it's a real credit to the committee that that we were able to do this year in and year out. The Friends is a 501c3 nonprofit corporation. Our primary purpose is to help educate the public about the Battle of San Jacinto, the Texas Revolution. We also advocate the preservation and protection of the San Jacinto battlefield. And in addition to the symposium, we raise funds for archaeology at the park, for restoration of marshes at the park, for historical interpretation, and land acquisition, and we also serve as the fiscal agent for the official San Jacinto Day commemorative ceremony, which will be this Monday, and also the annual San Jacinto reenactment, and the First Texas Volunteers, which is a group that helps restore the interior of the battleship Texas. Our motto is that every Texan should be a friend of San Jacinto. So if you're not already a member, we'd like to encourage you to be so. We have a website, friendsofsanjacinto.org, and there should be some information in your packet about our organization. Our president is Jan DeVault, and you'll be hearing from her at lunch. And with that, is Sylvia Garcia here? Yes, she is. She is. Great. I'd like to introduce the Honorable Sylvia Garcia. She is Harris County Commissioner, Precinct 2. Her precinct covers the area of the Battleground. Ms. Garcia has served on more than 25 community boards and commissions and has served as chairperson or honorary chairperson of numerous charity functions. She's one of the great political leaders of Harris County, and we're very pleased to have her give a short presentation before we begin. Also like to mention that we have another politician here, Tommy Atkinson from Bexar County, County Commissioner. So thank you very much for coming.
Well, I felt like, I was lost, but now I am found. First of all, I want to welcome everybody here from Ida Harris County. Welcome to Houston, Harris County, and Precinct 2. We're glad you're here with us this morning. And for those of you from the Houston area and Harris County, let's give all our friends from outside of our area a big round of applause. And thank you all for coming. I'm glad that There's a commissioner here from San Antonio. He and I have worked together on a number of issues around the state, particularly jail overcrowding. And I'm pleased to tell me I had no idea you had interest in the same topic. So now we'll have even more things to talk about at our next conference. But what I wanted to do this morning is not just welcome you, but to just give you just a little glimpse of what we're doing up and down Battleground Road. And I wanted to do that in the time that I've been allotted to do my welcome this morning, because there is nothing more important to me than preserving the historic sites in that area and doing all that we can to make it more inviting and more attractive so that we can get more tourists, more children, and more people to come visit our area. And what I'd like to talk about this morning is David G. Burnett Park, which we recently did the first phase of redevelopment. And this is what the park looks like. And David G. Burnett Park is on the North Landing and on the northern part of Battleground Road, which we will be renaming Independence Parkway. This is a portion of Independence Parkway that the county has owned for years. The southern portion is a portion that was previously owned by TxDOT, and they recently transferred the property over to our precinct. I think last time I was here, I mentioned to you about Project Stars. Can we go back to the other slide, Dustin? Project Stars. And this is the epic art that I mentioned to you all the last time I visited with you. And 2 more tanks will get epic art in about 2 weeks. So that project moves forward of putting historic art on our storage tanks in and around 225 and Battleground Road. From I-10 along the causeway, we're adding basic safety features to make the road a little safer and a little cleaner and a little more inviting. You'll end up on the North Landing parks, and there we'll have park space, green space, and parking spaces where we'll give families a chance to be able to sit down and watch the water and go down and have some fun. And we're calling this area Lynchburg Plaza. And then you'll end up going further down, and you'll see the area where the runaway scrape took place. And we'll have strategically placed around our area signage and wayfinding so that the tourists can know and learn more about the area and what occurred there. Now, the ferry takes us across the channel to the South Landing. We are already planning Juan Seguin Park. I mentioned that to you last time I was here, that we acquired some property, and that particular park has been named after Juan Seguin. Another next stop for family and visitors as they go down and travel down Battleground Road, of course, down by the battleship, we'll continue to go, and as business picks up, we'll be able to be doing a little more roadside enhancements. But that whole area between 225 and I-10, you'll begin to see more trees, banner poles, more lighting, and hopefully something more inviting for our tourists to come and enjoy and read and learn about Texas history. Again, we're doing our part in Precinct 2 to make sure that we can do whatever we can to upgrade our roads around there and make it a more pleasant stay for visitors. If y'all have any questions, I'll be around for a little while, but please know that we're working real hard to do our part to protect our history, to restore it, and to be able to pass it on. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Commissioner Garcia. Our moderator today is Dr. James Crisp. Jim was born in Henrietta, Texas. He's a graduate of Rice University and received a PhD from Yale, and he currently teaches history at North Carolina State University. He is author of Sleuthing the Alamo, which won the T.R. Fehrenbach Award from the Texas Historical Commission. Jim is a veteran of our symposium, as many of you know. He was a speaker at the first symposium. At the second symposium, he asked such insightful questions from the audience that we decided to make him the moderator during the third symposium, and he's been the moderator ever since. So we appreciate that he's coming back again. And with that, I would like to introduce Dr. Crisp, and we'll begin our program for today. Again, thank you very much for coming. We'll have a break in the morning, and then lunch will be in another room, and we'll give additional details as we go throughout the day. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff. That was a polite way of saying I was a heckler at the second annual symposium, and I think it was Steve Harden that I was heckling, as a matter of fact. And Steve's with us here today too, and we're glad to have him. Although he, I thought you might. I thought you might. I want to begin, I guess, today in honor of Stuart Reed by quoting a Scotsman, Robert Burns. Oh, wad some power the gift to gie us, to see ourselves as others see us. And if you couldn't understand my brogue just then, it was, would some power the gift give us to see ourselves as others see us. And when we started talking about this symposium, we're going to start talking about the next symposium tonight. We usually start brainstorming these things a year in advance. Stuart's name was one of the ones that came up, and as we always try to bring new perspectives to Texas history. And certainly we're doing that this time, with Stuart casting Texas history into a much broader platform of understanding with his work on Dr. James Grant, that elusive and enigmatic person, very active and influential in the early and middle stages of the Texas Revolution. I had heard Miguel Angel Gonzalez Quiroga talk about the multiple connections between North Mexico and Texas at an Alamo forum a few years ago. And as we began talking about these things, the idea of expanding the horizons of Texas history emerged. Those of you who have read that little book I did that Jeff mentioned know that I am really heavily influenced by the work of all people, a Haitian anthropologist by the name of Michel Rolfe-Trouillot. Trouillot talks a lot about, he's an anthropologist who looks at historians and how history is done. And he talks a lot about the production and distribution and consumption of history, because history is a cultural activity that historians have to look at seriously. History is produced outside the classroom and outside the academy. History is produced by people like yourselves who teach and write and talk about history, or just love to read history, and you're also consumers of history. And there's a lot of contention that goes on with history. People arguing their positions. Sometimes they don't even know why they believe what they believe. They just know they believe it really strongly. Like that woman who threatened to gut me with a Bowie knife outside the Alamo one day. I eventually did some missionary work and made her a friend. But in bringing these perspectives from the United Kingdom, from North Mexico, we're looking at Texas from angles that are going to reveal things about Texas that we might not have realized ourselves. Steve Harrigan, who's going to be our first speaker today, is one of those people who tries to tell the truth by lying. That is, he writes fiction, and really good fiction. And unlike a lot of Texas historians, he acknowledges that what he's writing is fiction. And any of you who've read Steve's novels or other really good works of art, of literature, know that there is a kind of truth that you can reach by trying to get inside people's minds and putting characters in a situation. And then if you're like most of the novelists I've talked to, they find that their characters take on a life and a mind of their own and start going in directions that the novelist never anticipated. And what Steve is going to be talking about is looking at Texas history with a novelist's eyes, as he said. And I can tell you, after having read The Gates of the Alamo, that I believe he achieved a truth there about what Texas was like on the eve of the Revolution that most Texas historians had never achieved. When you can close that book and say, yeah, now I sort of understand what it was like. then that's a level of truth that's hard to get to. And if you can get that through the documentation, that's great. If you can get it through the skills of a novelist, that's wonderful too. This afternoon, we're going to talk to a couple of people who are very much engaged in the distribution, and then from their consumers and students, the consumption of history. You know, you can have wonderful academic monographs between covers, and if they never get out to the ordinary person, you really haven't achieved what you should achieve if you're writing history. And Drianna Belden, through her portal to Texas history, using the latest technology to bring people sitting in their pajamas somewhere right up to a document that historians used to have to travel hundreds, perhaps thousands of miles to see. And to have those documents from at least 70 museums and archives there on the web for anyone to see and use and examine and synthesize, that's just a remarkable achievement. And most of us are of an age that all of this is new. All of this has come about even in the latter half of our lives, and some of us, like me, are not entirely comfortable with it, at least in terms of using it in the classroom. I use chalk as my technological device in the classroom. I'm not even comfortable with that whiteboard. I'm more comfortable with the blackboard. But Drianna is going to tell us about some of the things that she and her colleagues at the University of North Texas are doing to bring history out to the wider world. And our final speaker, or one of our afternoon speakers, our other afternoon speaker today, Betsy Davis, has been taking history to those most important consumers, and those are those fourth graders in their Texas history class. I've taught seventh grade Texas history classes and fourth grade Texas history classes, and I love them. And I think I love the fourth graders the best because, as I've told so many of my colleagues, the hormones haven't kicked in yet at the fourth grade, and they tend to kind of concentrate on what you're saying rather than everything that's going on in their lives and with their fellow classmates. And they're smart kids, and they've begun to realize that they have minds of their own, and they don't believe everything they hear, and they're willing to ask not only good questions but to think for themselves. And Betsy is one of those people who has most engaged fourth graders in her career as teaching Texas history in the Texas public schools, and so they're expanding. Drianna and Betsy expanding the horizons of Texas history. So we're going to be looking outward and seeing other people looking back at us, and I hope you enjoy this symposium today as much as those of us who have been anticipating it are going to enjoy it. When you think about something happening for a year and then it finally happens, well, we're not surprised anymore. We were, I guess, the first couple of years that it actually came off, but now we're just thrilled that we're able to conceive something like this and then make it happen, and especially thrilled by the number of people that are here in the audience today. We're really happy that you're here. Let me begin by introducing Steve Harrigan. He's a faculty fellow at the Mishner Center for Writers at the University of Texas, the author, as I mentioned, of Gates of the Alamo, a talking head on more TV documentaries than I can count, and always talking well. I first saw him on one of those over at Steve Hardin's house, old house in Pflugerville, and then I saw Steve in Austin that night, and this is really one of the high points of my life. I stopped him on the street of a sidewalk cafe, and I said, "Aren't you Steve Harrigan?" And he really thrilled me by saying, "Yes, aren't you Jim Crisp?" And I knew I had arrived, and I hadn't even become a talking head by then, but he had seen me at some history function and realized who I was, and we've been consulting and arguing with each other ever since. I'm going to do what I always do when Jeff Dunn tells me to do something, and that's just ignore him. All of you have a long biography and bio of Steve in your official program. I'm not going to repeat that. There's nothing worse than the professor getting up and reading to you out of the textbook. So if you can read about what Steve has done and what he's doing and where he is and where he was born and where he went to school and all those wonderful things. But rather than have me talk about Steve anymore, I want Steve to talk to you about seeing the fact and fiction, the truth and myth of Texas through a novelist's eyes. So please welcome Steve Harrigan.
Thanks, Jim. I've forgotten that moment. It was exciting for me to see the great Dr. Crisp on the streets of Austin. I'm here because of really one thing, my novel, The Gates of the Alamo, which came out in 2000, the year 2000. And during which time, or up to and about that time, I was a sort of semi-expert on the Alamo and other aspects of the Texas Revolution. That was 8 years ago. I'm no longer an expert because I haven't been able to keep up with all the information that has come out. I'm on to other projects, but I was sitting in my office the other day looking at my bookshelf and thought I would make a list for fun of all the books and all that have come out that were not available to me when I was doing my research on this novel in 2000. Since 2000, here is a partial list of the books that have been published on either the Alamo, the Texas Revolution, San Jacinto, this basic area in which we're all interested in. Of course, there's the inimitable Sleuthing the Alamo by Dr. Crisp. There's just out today is General Vicente Filasola's analysis of Jose Urrea's military diary that's edited by Greg Dimmick. There's The Alamo Reader by Todd Hanson, Lone Star Nation by H.W. Brands, Lone Star Rising by William C. Davis, Sam Houston by James L. Haley, Passionate Nation by James L. Haley, A Line in the Sand by Randy Roberts and James S. Olson, Alamo Traces by Thomas Ricks Lindley, The Alamo Story by J.R. Edmondson, Sea of Mud by Greg Dimmick, The Illustrated Alamo, 1836 by Mark Lemon, Texian Macabre by Stephen L. Hardin. By the way, Steve is here. That is a terrific book for all of you who are from Houston or want to know about the history of Houston better. You got to get this book. It's about the founding of Houston. It's wonderful. Crisis in the Southwest by Richard Bruce Winters, Sacrifice at the Alamo by Richard Bruce Winters, Death of a Legend by Bill Groneman, The Davy Crockett Almanac by William Chimurka, The Alamo Anthology by William Chimurka, American Legend, The Real-Life Adventures of Davy Crockett by Buddy Levy. I'm getting long-winded here, but I want to get through this list. David Crockett, Hero of the Common Man by William Groneman, The Alamo, A Cultural History by Frank Thompson, Santa Ana of Mexico by Will Fowler, In the Footsteps of Davy Crockett by Randall Jones, The Breach by Brian Kaufman, One Domingo Morning by Ned Anthony Humacher, Folly and Glory by Larry McMurtry, Almontes, Texas by Jack Jackson, Uniforms of the Alamo by Bruce Marshall, New Orleans and the Texas Revolution by Edward L. Miller, 18 Minutes by Stephen L. Moore, The Better Part of Valor by Trish Bennett, Remember the Alamo by William W. Johnstone, Remember the Alamo Memory, Modernity, and the Master Symbol by Ricardo R. Flores, The Alamo 1836 by Stephen L. Hardin and Angus McBride, The Alamo, An Illustrated History by Edwin P. Hoyt, Eyewitness to the Alamo, revised by William Groneman, Goliad, The Other Battle by William R. Bradle, The Other Alamo by William R. Bradle, The Texas War for Independence by Alan Huffines, and On the Crockett Trail by Rod Timaeus. Thank you for indulging me in that list, but I just wanted to emphasize the amazing amount of scholarship and interest that has been brought to a full realization in the last 8 years about this subject that we're also interested in. And I'm leaving aside, I'm sure, many books as well. I didn't even mention the children's books, of which there must be twice as many. I didn't mention the 2004 movie, The Alamo, that was a occasion not only itself, but a number of novelizations, making of books. I didn't mention the numerous television documentaries about the subject, and I didn't mention the incredibly energetic and fruitful websites that have grown up over the subject of the Alamo and the Texas Revolution. And one of the things that interests me is that the fact that all this scholarship about the Alamo, I think you can make a case that the greater part of it was probably written by white males, more or less my age, and was occasioned or incubated, possibly, by two separate works of fiction, and rather wild fiction at that. One was the 1955 movie and TV series, Davy Crockett, King of the Wild Frontier, starring Fess Parker. And one was 4 years later, the epic movie, The Alamo, made by John Wayne. I mention this because everybody I know who seems to be writing about these subjects seems to be kind of like me, kind of the same age, and we share, certain childhood memories. And the memory is certainly the case for me that the Crockett movie, the Fess Parker King of the Wild Frontier movie, was a seminal event in my young life. I was 7 years old when that movie came out, living in Abilene, Texas, where we didn't get the channel that showed it on TV, so I had to wait for the actual movie to be assembled and put on the screen. And what was, as you remember, some of you remember, this was an amazing event, amazing cultural event. This was Harry Potter, Star Wars, all rolled into one. It was it was a great nexus of marketing and mass entertainment. Probably for the first time in American history, there was just this collision of these two forces. And what was so remarkable, I think, about this movie, which is rather forgettable, except for those of us who can't forget it, is the final episode, Davy Crockett at the Alamo, the last third of the movie. And in this movie, it's a cheap movie. They didn't build expensive sets, but they had this gloomy sort of matte painting background that was intoxicatingly otherworldly. It just looked strange and alien. And the people in the Alamo in that movie they were caught in this horizonless void. It was, you watching it as a 7-year-old kid, you had this sense of doom, of sort of claustrophobic doom. It was a very lonely and frightful place, and a very haunting place. And at the end of the movie, something happened that had never happened before in my experience as a 7-year-old boy. The hero died. Or at least seemed to die, because the movie faded out as Davy Crockett was swinging his rifle on the Alamo ramparts as the Mexican soldados were approaching with their bayonets. And so there was this kind of hovering non-reality about that, this sense of unconcluded business and trauma that I think galvanized a generation into pushing their way into a better, clearer understanding of what these events were. The same forces, I think, were at work in the John Wayne movie, which came out 4 or 5 years later. And what I remember most vividly about that movie, A, is being let out of school to see it, and B, is watching the credit sequence, where Dmitri Tiomkin's amazingly lovely score against this beautiful matte painting of the Alamo as it was said to appear at that time. Just, again, gave a sense of a haunted palace, and it excited my curiosity about what this place was and what all these events were really about. And again, both of these movies had very little to do with the historical reality of the Alamo or the Texas Revolution. They were blatantly fiction. But one of the things that fiction can do is can spark a lifetime obsession in a reader. It doesn't have to be good fiction. Jim was kind enough to say that my book was good fiction, but that there can be bad fiction that just sets you off on this path because something grabs you about that, something stirs you. That was definitely the case with me. I was an impressionable kid who grew up to be, kind of by accident, a nonfiction writer. I became a staff writer for Texas Monthly Magazine and wrote for other magazines and was always traveling around, interviewing people, absorbing information, regurgitating data. But one of the things I realized was that as a magazine journalist, the things that registered with most force to me were not facts, but feelings. When I got an understanding of what a place felt like, what a person felt like, when I could empathize with their situation in a way that was visceral and clear to me, then the story became alive. But facts themselves were just facts. And there were places I realized that fiction could take me as a reader and places where I wanted it to take me as a writer. And that's why I decided to start writing novels, because there was the world of fact was not big enough for me. I wanted to be in there. I wanted to be with the participants of the story. And there's a interesting and eternal debate over how much responsibility a fiction writer has when it comes to historical reality. Not much, actually, is the basic answer, as anybody who's ever seen a Hollywood movie knows. But it's interesting to sort of think about and ponder these issues. I was reading not long ago the fourth volume of Larry McMurtry's Bender saga, which is this epic, 4-volume novel about the American West. And the concluding volume, and some of the concluding scenes take place at the Alamo. And in this book, at the end of it, there's a major character, Lord Barry Bender, who is meeting with Stephen F. Austin, Davy Crockett, and Jim Bowie at Washington on the Brazos at a dance that Austin is giving before Crockett and Bowie are to leave for the Alamo. And one of this Lord Barry Bender says to Crockett, "It stirs my blood just to think of a good fight. Can't wait to see action, in fact. The blare of bugles, the thud of cannon. Bowie and Crockett and I will go tomorrow. Crockett assures me it will be just a skirmish, be back in a day or two. The place is called San Antonio." And then somebody asked Crockett, to explain more about what's going on in San Antonio. And he says, "Oh, we won't have much of a scrap in San Antonio." And she asked, "Why not?" "The big battle will be farther east. Sam Houston's over on the plain of San Jacinto getting ready. He'll show General Santa Anna what's what, no question of that." And so Crockett and Bowie ride off to the Alamo, and the siege takes place, and apparently during the last hours of the siege, McMurtry writes that there had been 1,000 Mexican casualties, and there were Mexican bodies all heaped up piled in heaps in the mission courtyard. This is before the final assault. And when the assault comes, Jim Bowie is described up and whirling like a dervish, jabbing and striking with his big knife. And at the very end, Lord Barry Bender, he's about to be run through by a Mexican soldado, and he yells at him, "I'd speak to somebody about those uniforms. They make you look like clowns." This is just before he's about to be stabbed. Now, I guarantee you that Larry McMurtry knows for a fact that Jim Bowie and Davy Crockett and Stephen F. Austin were not at a ball in Washington on the Brazos, several weeks before the Alamo. He knows that Sam Houston was not laying a trap for Santa Anna in San Jacinto. He knows there were not 1,000 Mexican casualties even before the battle. There weren't 1,000 Mexican casualties after the battle. So he made a very informed and I think respectable and defensible position that history for him was just going to be a jumping off place. He was going to use this information as he saw fit as a novelist. He has done that from Lonesome Dove on, and it has served him very, very well. But there are different, when I started to think about writing about the Alamo, my attitude was different. For one thing, I knew this was going to be a very long book, and I knew that the readers would be annoyed with me if I wrote a book of that size in which the factual elements were not reliable. So I set myself this vow of historical credibility. I wanted to create as much as I could, an airtight historical background for the fictional characters that I was going to create and plug into it. I had no idea how to go about learning enough about this period of Texas history. I was a journalist by training, by experience. I'm not an historian. But one of the good things about being a journalist is that you learn very early on not to be shy about picking up the telephone and calling the people who already know the information that you need. So when I got started on this, I read all the books that were then available, and then I called the authors of those books, those who were still alive. I called Steve Harden, I called Jim Crisp, I called Tom Lindley and Alan Huffines, a number of very well-known names in this field, and I asked them the questions that I needed to know based on the research I had done. I had a lot of decisions to make and a lot of questions to ask them. For one thing, I needed to create a world. I didn't want to write characters. I didn't want to make Crockett, Bowie, Santa Anna, people like that my main characters. I wanted to come up with characters that I could understand more, that were in one sense or another elements of me. I wanted characters who were ambivalent and conflicted, maybe not so heroic, maybe not so sure of themselves. And so I began to create people through whose lenses and through whose experiences we might be able to see the events of the Alamo in 1836 in a slightly different way. My main character became, of all things, a botanist because I wanted somebody who could portray. One of the things I very much wanted to do was show what Texas was like in 1835 and 1836, what it physically was like, and I thought a botanist was a great way to get at that. I wanted characters who showed both sides of the conflict, because one of the things I most wanted to do was give a credible understanding of what the forces were involved in this, not to show it just from the traditional Anglo side, but also, of course, from the Mexican side, from the Irish side, from the Native American side, because it seemed to me like a tremendous opportunity would be lost unless I could put all those elements into the story. So I made a lot of decisions, a lot of strategic decisions about who to show the story through, a lot of intuitive decisions about what kind of people those were, what they were feeling. As Jim said earlier, characters can get away from you, and I wanted to allow myself to believe in these characters thoroughly enough so that they would get away from me, but they couldn't. The rule was they couldn't break through the bonds of history. And one of I wandered into deeper waters than I thought when I was researching this book. I thought it would take me, a year or so. It took me 8 years to write the book. And one of the reasons was because the Alamo is so buried beneath a myth beneath layers of myth and legend that it's very, very difficult, as most of you know, to get to the true story of what happened. And it was a lot of the time I spent researching this book was spent in arguing or in refereeing arguments among historians. There was many of you know about the narrative or the diary or whatever you want to call it of Jose Enrique de la Peña, the Mexican officer who states in his narrative that Davy Crockett was captured and executed at the Alamo. Well, this wasn't just a matter of academic concern to me whether Crockett was captured and executed. It was vital. I couldn't say in a novel, I couldn't say on the one hand people argue this, on the other hand that. I had to have Davy Crockett die, and I had to show how that happened. So I had to evaluate sources in my own in the way I was, only way I could, which was kind of whatever kind of gut feeling I could come away with, I had to evaluate sources such as Pena. And Jim Crisp and Tom Lindley have this fascinatingly abstruse argument that I'm sure many of you have read, going back and forth in the pages of the Alamo Journal, about whether the Pena diary was a forgery or not, how reliable it is. But I had to read through all of their stuff, talk to everybody else, and try to figure out exactly what I thought about it. And there were innumerable issues like that. Where do you come down on one side or another of an issue, and how does that serve the fictional story I wanted to tell? In some cases, the pursuit of historical truth was not always beneficial to me as a novelist. One of the scenes I was most eager to write was the best scene in the Alamo story, that the scene where Travis calls his men together on before the last night of the siege to tell them that all hope is lost and that they're outnumbered, they can't get away, they can't surrender, they won't surrender, and that Travis is going to stay till the bitter end, sell his life as dearly as possible, and he draws a line in the sand and asks all the men in the Alamo who will stay and die with him to cross the line, and everybody but one does. The reason that's such an important element for me was what you're always looking for in a work of fiction is a moment of clear choice, where the protagonists have to make a decision that will propel the story forward in a different direction. And to me, this was a beautiful moment. It was the linchpin of the Alamo story, the idea of these men willingly dying for a cause they believed in. But I don't have to tell most of you in this room, and I think most of the historians here will agree with me, that this moment never happened. It's part of the Alamo lore, but there's really literally nothing to uphold it after you analyze it fairly thoroughly. So when I realized that in the course of my research for this book, I was very disappointed. And then I started to think, maybe I'm not so disappointed, because the line in the sand story had always seemed a little bit more hyperbolic than real to me. It felt a little, there was an element of fiction to it that I didn't quite grab onto. And when I realized what had really happened, that there were no grand gestures perhaps in the Alamo, but just maybe a sense of desperate survival, that there were no clear choices, but just this slow, murky entrapment, I began to believe in this moment, or in this situation, in a more powerful and realistic way than I ever had before. And I realized, when I started to think about what these men must really have been like at that moment, dirty and scared and homesick and cold, I started to understand, I know I can put myself there. I feel that more than I feel the reality of the famous line in the sand story. And that became kind of my benchmark as I was writing this book, the idea that the emotional truth that a novelist is looking for is more often than not found in the actual truth of history. It gives you the tools you need, the emotions you need to create a credible story that people will relate to if you will just listen and pay attention to the historical record. When it comes to San Jacinto, I had only one short chapter. I had to make a decision early in the book about whether San Jacinto would be part of the book or not, and I decided it had to be, because I didn't want to just have everybody die at the end of the book and that was it at the Alamo. So I had to do the same process of research with San Jacinto as I had with the Alamo. But then I realized fairly early on, that I could just cut to the chase in this scene. That's one thing a fiction writer can do. When I didn't have to set up the Battle of San Jacinto. I didn't have to talk about the skirmish that took place before with Sidney Sherman, or the artillery duel the day before. I just had to put the reader right in the thick of the battle. But I still had to work hard to understand what that battle was all about. And I remember one memorable day with J.C. Martin, who was the former guest director of the San Jacinto Museum, took me and Elizabeth Crook, who later wrote Promised Lands, her novel about the Goliad Massacre, and Jeff Long, who later wrote Empire of Bones, another novel about San Jacinto. When Jeff and Elizabeth and I we realized we were all writing books about the Texas Revolution, we divvied up the battles. And so I got the Alamo, Jeff got San Jacinto, and Elizabeth got Goliad. JC took us up to the very top of the monument under the star, and we looked out over the battlefield. And I walked the ground later. I walked up as much as you can toward the direction of the Mexican camp from the Texan camp. And I realized at that point, oh yeah, I get it. I had never understood before how the Texians could have surprised the Mexicans, given that everybody knew where everybody was, and it was because of that rise of land, which is now somewhat obscured. And that walking the ground was the most important aspect of learning about the Battle of San Jacinto, and walking the ground in a kind of metaphorical sense was absolutely crucial to me in writing this book, and I think to any novelist in trying to write a book that has a credible human emotional story against a credible historical background. I had not just to read about Brown Bess muskets and what it's like to carry one up from northern Mexico. I had to hold one in my hands and see how heavy they were. I had not just to read about Travis's letter from the Alamo. I needed to hold it in my hands and see that the words, "I shall never surrender or retreat," was underlined not once, not twice, but 3 times. When you can hold these documents, diaries, letters, when you can be in the place where the events happened, you get so much closer to what you need to know as both an historian or as a fiction writer. And so my goal became, when writing this historical novel, was to write it as much as possible as a contemporary novel, to know the material, to know the world as so thoroughly that I could write about it effortlessly, as if these were events that had happened to me or a world I knew firsthand. One of the most rapturous dreams I've ever had in my life was when I was about 2/3 of the way through the book. And I went to sleep one night, and I had a dream that I had been invited to a cocktail party in 1836. And I walked into a room just like this one, and there were hundreds of people there, and they were all dressed in exactly the right period clothing. They were all speaking with the same inflections, the same vocabulary that I had read about or intuited from the sources. Their postures were correct for the time. And I had a notebook in the dream, and I was just, writing like crazy. It was so exciting. I couldn't believe it, and that I had the luck to be here. And then I woke up, and then I was back to the microfilm. But that moment was to me so exciting, and to some degree I created my own artificial reality that I could believe in enough to write this book. It was the only way I knew how to write an historical novel. It was the only way I cared to write one. There's a school of thought, and again, I give historical novelists all the range in the world in terms of what facts they want to use, what facts they want to distort. But there's a school of thought that says fiction is searching for a higher truth than history. And I don't think there's a high truth or a low truth. I think there's just the truth. And I use that as kind of my benchmark. I'm going to be as real as I can to the facts as I can discover them. And without that bedrock of fact, and without the participants in these events in the first place, who left behind letters and diaries and reminiscences, without the historians who went over this stuff so assiduously and interpreted it and helped me understand it, without the teachers who have disseminated this information and made it part of the common currency of our experience, a fiction writer has nothing to write about, because there's no basis from which to begin. So I am, as a novelist, I sort of humbly and gratefully cede the field to all of you who work in the field of fact, and I deeply appreciate both the opportunity to speak to you today and the opportunity to say thank you. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. One of the great things about coming to the San Jacinto Symposium is that you not only have the ability to listen to these people firsthand, but also to ask them questions. We have two ways of asking questions today. For a few minutes after each speaker gives his or her talk, we can take some direct, oral, spontaneous questions, something that just might have popped into your head. And Jeff, I believe we have microphones, is that correct? Where are they located? On the side? Is there one on the other side as well? Or just the one here? Well, there's one here. I know that for sure. If you have a quick question for Steve, you could make your way there. Of course, we don't have a lot of time for these, but we do have these yellow sheets. And these yellow sheets are here for the question and answer session that comes at the end of the day. We'll have all 5 panelists, if we can fit them all, up on the podium, and you may address your questions generally to the panelist or to one panelist in particular. And as you listen to the talks today, if you have any questions, please take the opportunity to ask them in one form or the other. I have a question for Steve. I don't see anyone at the microphone yet. Where's oh, you're right here. Okay, you'll have to speak very loud or I'll repeat your question for you.
Steve, you stoked my curiosity here. The story of Travis drawing the line in the sand with his sword, Frank De La Teja and I were talking about that one day, and he said it's one of those stories, if it isn't true, it ought to be true. Where do you think that originated in your research? Where did that first come from?
Let me just briefly repeat the question, and that is, where did we get this story of Travis drawing the line in the sand? See if that works.
Oh, does this work? Yes. I might have to defer at some point to the real historians in the room because it's been a long time since I've done my research on this. But it originated with a guy named William P. Zuber, who claimed to have heard it from the one guy, Lewis Rose, who claimed to have been the one who took up Travis up on his offer. Zuber heard it, he said, when he was, what is it, Jim, 8 or 9 years old? When
As a young man, and from his mother as well as from the original.
Right, yeah, and he heard it secondhand, reported on it 40 years later, wrote about it 40 years later that he had heard it, and said that that basically he was recalling recreating Travis's speech from the memory he had of hearing it from this guy 40 years ago. And he said, I added one element that I thought without which the scene would not be as dramatic, and that could only be the line in the sand. So I think that's a very thin reed upon which to hang a historical fact. I just... Jim or Steve,
some of what's in our textbook comes from recovered memory syndrome, which is not exactly reliable, as a lot of psychologists and other people have found. But yeah, I was hoping that Steve would mention that Zuber acknowledged that he had added an unnamed element to it, and I agree with Steve that it's probably that line in the sand. Now, Steve, does that mean that Zuber's just a better novelist than you are? Or?
He's excellent. but the other thing, though, that I think is interesting in this whole question is that on Travis's body apparently was found a letter by Major Robert Williamson, which was later published. We don't have the original. It was published in El Mosquito Mexicano, this newspaper, in which Williamson says, hold on, basically, help is on the way. I think if Travis called his men together the night before the final assault, it was to say, look, I got this letter. All hope is not lost. You know, this is what you would say to people if you were trying to keep them on the reservation. You know, help is on the way. People are coming to help us. All we have to do is hold on. I think that was probably the tenor of the conversation. Rather than one of despair, it was probably one of hope.
Were there any other questions from the audience?
Dr. Chris,
Yes.
on this same issue, did Susannah Dickerson or any other survivor of the Alamo ever speak to this question, this issue?
To the line in the sand?
Yes.
I don't think so.
Not
Steve.
directly, no. I mean, there were, I think people have inferred from some of her statements that there might have been such a moment, but I don't recall that she ever said anything. I think it's all from Zuber.
John, are you going to the microphone? Yeah. Wonderful. There's another person there already, I think.
Yeah, if I may, as a commissioner whose precinct includes the Alamo, I'm very interested in all aspects of it. Do you have any feel for whether, I think it's kind of interesting that the line in the sand may be just a fiction, and I appreciate the candor. But with respect to the flag that flew over the Alamo, was it the Twin Star flag of the province of Coahuila y Tejas, or was it the Constitution of 1824 flag, or do you know?
Well, I don't know. I don't think anybody knows for sure. It certainly wasn't the Constitution of 1824 flag. There's no source for that, unless I am mistaken.
Well, Reuben Potter, who wrote one of the first histories of the Alamo, said that the men fought under that flag. I think he was speaking metaphorically and rhetorically because independence had not been declared. But Onderdonk and McCardle and the other iconic artists of that scene will put the 1824 Constitution flag there. But let me tell you, when the gentlemen who were defending the Alamo and in San Antonio from the Texas Army sent their delegates to Washington on the Brazos, and when even the Bexar County delegates, Jose Antonio Navarro and Francisco Ruiz, they told them, if you don't vote for independence, you better not come back. So the idea that these men were flying the constitutional flag of 1824, I think, really is a myth. There's only one flag that we know for darn sure was there, and that's the flag of the New Orleans Grays, which was captured by the Mexican Army and is in Mexico City to this day. But in terms of the two-star flag of Coahuila y Tejas, there's pretty good evidence in the drawings that were made of the Alamo by was it Sanchez
Navarro.
Sanchez Navarro.
Also, there's Almonte's. Doesn't he reference the two-star?
I think
flag?
Almonte also mentioned that.
So that, I mean, that's a
flag.
good. The two-star flag is a good bet, don't you think? And then
Oh, yeah,
New Orleans Grays, but other than that, it's...
Yeah, I think so. John?
Yes, John Richardson, San Antonio, employee of the Alamo. Constituent of Tommy Atkinson. Just clarification on the Dickinson question. She was interviewed, as you probably know, late in life by several newspaper reporters. And journalism has improved, as you know, since the 19th century. Yeah, it has, actually.
Until recently.
Yeah. They were blatantly biased politically. Now that it's more subtle. But anyway, Dickinson is asked several times about the line in the sand after the story was published in 1873 in a Texas Almanac by Zuber. And she actually told different accounts. Sometimes they crossed the line to stay, sometimes they crossed the line to leave. So I think she was perhaps being a little led on somewhat by the reporters. In terms of the Rose account, initially it was published in 1873 in the Texas Almanac. Most people denied the plausibility of the story because everyone, of course, knew that everyone died in the Alamo. No one left. They actually questioned the existence of Moses Rose. And actually in the 1930s, there was a county clerk in Nacogdoches County, Robert Bruce Blake, who was going back and transcribing all these old court records. Nacogdoches, obviously one of the oldest areas in Texas being settled, going back to the Spanish land grants even. And he came across a series of depositions that were filed in the 1840s. And he came across the name of Lewis Rose, who was deposed by the, I assume in the county court, in order to establish the veracity of certain people's accounts, meaning that if you had an ancestor, or a relative, I should say, who died in the Battle of the Alamo, and you had to try to determine if they were there in order to receive the land grants, you had to find someone who could back up that story. So Rose is deposed several times in the 1840s. That information was uncovered in the 1930s, and that's when people started to realize that Rose really was there, and then also brought back into question the storyline in the sand. So at least it became more probable in terms of Rose being there. The position basically that we kind of are at right now, I think, is that we know that Rose was there. We know that he left. We're not sure under what circumstances he left. And that's sort of, I think, the best way to approach it. In terms of the letter quickly written by Robert Williamson, the first part of the letter says, by the time you read this letter, 60 men will already be there. Of course, that's another topic for conversation. Did those 60 extra men get there? And that obviously, as most people know, it's been a question of debate also recently. Just to play devil's advocate for a moment, if those 60 did not get there, and then the next passage, Williamson writes, by the time you read this, 60 men will already be there, and another 300 are on their way. Well, if you're looking around and not seeing the 60 men, what chances are that the 300 will get there? So we don't know for sure whether the 60 got there or not. That's a question for debate probably another time. But it is interesting to try to determine what these people's mindset were. And as a fiction writer, you have the leeway to sort of expand on that. And but I think your description in your book of sort of a quiet desperation, I think, is probably the reality of the situation. But there is movement back and forth. You do have men coming into the compound as support the 32 for Gonzalez. You have men and women leaving during the amnesty. So there is movement back and forth. So it certainly was possible. And the fact is, of course, as we know, those men did stay. And what motivated them to stay is open to debate. Yeah,
I think you're certainly open to debate. I think the reinforcements did get there because all the most reliable accounts of how many people died inside the Alamo seem to account for those extra men. As far as Susannah Dickinson, I made a point of discounting any newspaper interviews with her because they are just so absolutely florid and weird. And as you say, even by, I think, 1873 standards, the journalism and there was pretty poor. I think it was just hyperbolic, purple prose. I made a point to give a lot of credence to her 1876 testimony to the Adjutant General's office, which seems extremely sound to me and clear. As far as Lewis Rose, that's a whole can of worms. Again, it's been 8 years for me, and I'm sure you've read Alamo Traces by Tom Lindley, where he goes into that in huge detail. I can't remember, frankly, all the back and forth about whether Lewis Rose was really Stephen Rose or this and that, but if anybody wants to investigate it further, that's probably the best place to start.
Yeah, there are a lot of cans of worms out there, and we're not going to open any more of them just now. But if you have a particular can of worms you would like to have us open in the afternoon session, be sure and write these questions. And just to explain in another half minute's worth, these questions you should deliver to us after the last speaker has finished. Just bring them up here to the podium. I will censor them. Not really. I will organize them. And if we have a number of questions, then I'm sure a number of people asking the same question, I'll try to make sure that question gets asked, and we'll handle as many of them as there are. We have a lot of people out there, and there may be a lot of questions, but we'll do the best we can to do that. I had the opportunity a few weeks ago to have an extended conversation with a Mexican diplomat. A diplomat who was stationed in the Balkans before he was brought back to this side of the Atlantic. And one of the things he told me is that as an educated, a well-educated Mexican young man of about my age, he believed when he was in his 20s and 30s that nothing good ever came out of the United States. And we talked about how there were other people on this side of the Rio Grande who felt the same way in a mirror image. He told me that his experience in the Balkans led him to reflect on grudges. And as he talked about the Greeks and the Serbians and the others that he had met there, holding grudges for 200, 300, 400 years, longer than since Texas was Tejas. He like me, had reached a certain maturity later in life as we began to poke through some of the myths and the stereotypes and the caricatures, his of the United States and the vicious racist Anglos who had poured into Mexico. Mine, I won't even have to repeat, of what we were told about Mexicans when we were growing up and reading Texas history movies and seeing what our culture told us. One of my acquaintances who was raised here in Houston became a very senior academic, told me that when he was in the 7th grade and the teacher began to talk about the Battle of the Alamo in the class that was going to cover that, she asked the 2 Hispanic boys in the class, the young men in the 7th grade, to get up and leave because they weren't worthy of hearing the story of bravery that she was about to tell. And if you think that's atypical, it's not. I've talked to a number of people of my age, including Richard Flores, the anthropologist, Andres Tijerina, who audience people here people who have been in this audience have heard, and they experienced very similar things. It was his teacher who pointed to Andres and said, "It was your grandfather who killed Davy Crockett." And when you're 9 years old, that's tough to take. That's very tough to take. There are few people as well situated to see from both sides of the Rio Grande over to the other side than Miguel Angel Gonzalez Quiroga, who has spent his life traveling back and forth and looking back and forth from north to south across that river of contention, seeing the borderlands as a whole, seeing the similarities as well as the differences. Miguel is a graduate of this institution, the University of Houston. He has served in the United States Marines. He's a professor at the Universidad Autónoma de Nuevo León in Monterrey. He is an eloquent speaker who is especially interested in the connections of labor and capital and business, as well as the military expeditions and adventures that have both united as well as separated Texas from North Mexico over the last 2 centuries. And without further ado, I would like for him to come and speak to us on commonality and conflict, Northeast Mexico and the Texas Revolution and Republic, 1835 to 1845. So please welcome Professor Gonzalez Quiroga.
Gracias, Jim. Agradezco mucho tus amables palabras. I'll turn to English. Did I hear a sigh of relief there? I'm honored to be here, and I want to thank everyone associated with the San Jacinto Symposium for inviting me. You've made me feel at home. As Jim told you, Houston was my home for some years. When my parents came from Mexico, they decided to live here in Houston. In fact, we lived just a few blocks from here on Houston's east side. Me and my sisters, one of whom is here today with her husband. And I have real great memories of those times. One of the best was of a red brick building on McKinney Street downtown that housed the Houston Public Library. And occasionally on Saturdays, I'd take the bus downtown and go into that library and just get lost among those books. I even read a few of them. And it opened up a new world for me. It expanded my horizons. And that's exactly what we're going to try to do today during this symposium. The war for Texas independence ended on a day of spring in 1836 at San Jacinto. This was the end of the war, but it was not the end of the warfare. Armed conflict between the Mexican government and the Texans had begun in 1835 and would continue off and on until 1845, when the former Mexican province was annexed to the United States. During that 10-year period, Mexico and the breakaway republic engaged in numerous skirmishes. Many battles that kept the border region in a state of turmoil. The Santa Fe, Somerville, and Mier expeditions carried out by the Texans between 1841 and 1843, and 2 attacks on San Antonio by the Mexican Army in 1842 were only the most visible episodes in a state of continuous conflict. Now, this is hardly an auspicious setting in which to render an account of the multiple ways in which cooperation developed between Anglos and Mexicans, but that's precisely the aim of this presentation. Anglo settlers, merchants, and politicians harbored objectives that converged with those of the Mexican residents of the border region to form a commonality of interests that promoted cooperation between the two races. Amidst the conflict, they established mutually beneficial relations and interactions in such diverse areas as land speculation, the defense of federalism, and commerce. And many of these relations and interactions occurred in a region of northeast Mexico, including Tamaulipas, Nuevo León, Coahuila, and part of Chihuahua. The pattern of collaboration was established as early as the 1810s during the independence movement in New Spain. American and European merchants, captains, speculators were eager to serve the rebels and obtain profit through the use of boats and the sale of arms and munitions. Many of these activities were orchestrated by the New Orleans Association, made up of merchants and lawyers. I can't believe lawyers would do such a thing. Can you, Jeff? This group was involved in financing parts of the Hidalgo Revolution in Mexico, and these early signs of cooperation would be repeated often and reveal a willingness by members of both races to set aside their mutual mistrust when a beneficial operation or transaction could be carried out. An area where Anglos and Mexicans found common ground before Texas independence involved the colonization of that province. Now, this process is well known, especially after the meticulous research of Mexican historian Miguel Soto, who was here a number of years ago. So I'm not going to go into the details. Sufficient to say that the colonization laws, especially that of Coahuila y Texas, were very generous, attracting many settlers, adventurers, and speculators. Mexican nationals, like the ones you see here, Lorenzo de Zavala, José Antonio Mejía, and José María Carvajal, participated with Americans like Joseph Verlaine, David Burnett, and Joel Poinsett in schemes like the Galveston Bay and Texas Land Company in order to make a profit. Now, the actors involved in this colonization process, the national and state governments, the settlers, and the speculators, were all following a script called self-interest, some of them unaware that forces were being set in motion that would lead to Texas independence. Apart from economic interests, the 3 Mexican participants in the Galveston Bay Company, Zavala, Mejia, and Carvajal, also had a political agenda. All three were committed Federalists who embraced the cause of the Texans when they rebelled against the centralist government imposed by Santa Anna in 1835. Federalism provided another area of commonality between Anglos and Mexicans, and two episodes, the Texas Revolution and the Federalist Wars of 1840 in Mexico's Northeast, provide insights into the ways in which Anglos and Mexicans sought to unite in a common cause. The commitment to federalism among Mexicans of the Northeast and Texas was strong. Jose Urrea, one of Santa Anna's leading generals during the Texas Revolution, found strong support for the Constitution of 1824 and a willingness by many to take up arms and join the Texans. Members of the Texas Mexican elite, like Jose Antonio Navarro and Erasmo Seguin, believed that centralism was a threat to their economic and political interests, and they did not wish to have a central government in Mexico City or a state government in Saltillo control their province and prevent its development. In late 1835, when they still believed that the Texans had no other agenda than the defense of the Constitution of 1824, Mexicans joined in the siege of Béjar, providing men, supplies, and ammunition to aid the Texas rebels. In a like manner, many Anglo-Texans held that it was strategically advantageous to join with Mexican Federalists in their struggle against Santa Anna, since this would strengthen their own cause. This line of thinking is reflected in the expedition of James Grant and Frank Johnson, which included Mexican Texans under the leadership of Plácido Benavides of Victoria. Now, Stuart Reed, a little bit later on, is going to talk about this, so I'm not going to invade his topic. But two observations are worth making. The Texans sought an alliance with Federalists like Antonio Canales and Vital Fernandez, both from Mexico's Northeast, in order to combat Santa Anna and the centralist government. And second, each of the actors had their own agenda and pursued his own particular interests. Grant had his, and his Texan and Mexican followers had theirs. They all used federalism as a pretext to mask other ends. Another attempt to unite with Mexican Federalists was made during the Tampico expedition, which was supported by New Orleans merchants sympathetic to the Texas cause. The expedition was led by Antonio Mejia. This Cuban-born Mexican Federalist was part of a community of exiles in New Orleans in 1835 that included Valentin Gómez Farias and José María Carvajal. Mejia organized an expedition to Tampico in November 1835, which included about 150 Anglo adventurers in an attempt to provoke an uprising of Mexican Federalists against the government from Veracruz. Historian Eugene Barker has written that if Mejia's expedition had succeeded, it may have changed the course of events because Texans might have allied themselves with Mexican liberals. Unfortunately, the expedition was a dismal failure. Mejia overestimated the level of support his Federalist call would generate and underestimated the degree of rejection that the Anglo participants of his expedition would cause among the Mexican population. The Tampico expedition also reveals a large dose of deception by the participants. Mejia did not inform many of those who participated of its true nature. Edward Miller believes that many of the men who went with Mejia believed they were going to Brazoria, not Tampico. These men were, according to Miller, little more than cannon fodder for a cause that many of them neither understood nor supported. The merchants who promised support to Mejia were not sincerely interested in promoting Mexican federalism because they were less concerned with who was in charge in Mexico than they were with their own profit-making motives. They provided financial assistance on the condition that it be used to promote Texas independence. According to Miller, these merchants were not interested in rescuing Texas from a centralist despot. They represented an American attempt to seize Texas from Mexico altogether. The Texans continued to woo support in Mexico and shroud their movement in a Federalist pose until December 1835. The delegates at the consultation at San Felipe, in an attempt to attract Federalist support in Mexico, expressed in an enigmatic way that they would continue as part of the Mexican nation if it was governed by the Constitution of 1824. Randolph Campbell asserts that by this time, most Texian leaders had independence as their ultimate goal, but they saw the need to build strength before making an actual declaration. The consultation established a provisional governor and a general council, and a dispute emerged between these two with respect to the aid that would be given to General Mejia, who was offering his support to the Texans after his failed Tampico expedition. Governor Henry Smith did not trust Mejia and refused to authorize assistance for him. The General Council strongly disagreed with that position at a time when the Texans were still trying to find support from Mexican Federalists. Mejia finally gave up and returned to New Orleans. Miller says that this signaled the beginning of the end of the cooperation between Texian leaders and Mexican Federalists. Despite the mistrust generated by this first collaboration between Anglos and Mexicans, members of the two races came together once again 4 years later during the Federalist Wars in northeastern Mexico. General Jose Urrea, who had converted to Federalism, led a revolt in Tampico in October 1838, and it quickly spread to the border region where it was embraced by local elites. The uprising had its roots in the rejection of centralism. The protectionist policies of the central government and the inability of the Army to defend against Indian attacks further alienated the residents of the border region and drove many of them into the arms of federalism. Antonio Canales began the revolt in Tamaulipas and soon looked to Texas for support. By May 1839, Anglo-Texans were participating in the armed conflict. 25 Texans were among a Federalist force that attacked Monterrey and then Saltillo. In September, Canales included a party of 180 Texans led by Reuben Ross and Samuel Jordan on his attack of a centralist force near the Rio Grande town of Guerrero. This was the Battle of El Cántaro, known in Texas as Alcantara, and it resulted in a resounding Federalist victory. But Canales did not capitalize on this success. He tried and failed to take Matamoros and finally ended the siege of the city, which infuriated some of the Texans. 50 of them returned to Texas, while the rest continued with Canales as he headed for Monterrey, the capital of Nuevo León. Thinking that the city was poorly fortified, Canales attacked Monterrey in late December but was beaten back by Mariano Arista. Canales retreated toward the Rio Grande, and the Texans, disgusted by this turn of events, returned to Texas and dispersed. These defeats did not discourage the Federalists. They regrouped and in January 1840 organized a convention at Casablanca on the right bank of the Nueces River, where they established a governing structure that would be referred to by the Texans as the Republic of the Rio Grande. The principal Federalist leaders of Nuevo León, Coahuila, and Tamaulipas were on the governing council with Jesus Cárdenas as president and Canales as chief of military operations. These leaders sought support in Texas. Manuel María de Llano, governor of Nuevo León, had sent General Juan Pablo Anaya to Texas to solicit men, arms, and supplies. Anaya would inform the Texas government that in exchange for its support, the Federalists would be willing to recognize Texas independence. The Federalist leaders received a warm reception in Texas. They were able to obtain men, money, and moral support. In San Antonio, Samuel Maverick, mayor of the city, and others were active in the support of the federal cause. O'Driscoll's Tavern at Refugio served as headquarters for some of the Texan units. Samuel Powell, a longtime resident of Texas, provided the Federalists with a loan of $3,000. After their convention in January 1840, the Federalists stepped up their recruitment and fundraising efforts in Texas. In April, Canales met with President Lamar, who was friendly but non-committal. He told Canales that he could continue to seek men and supplies in Texas. In June, the people of Victoria gave the Federalists an enthusiastic reception. Leaders like Cárdenas and Canales were wined and dined by the citizens, and commercial firms welcomed their trade. Samuel Plummer of Victoria wrote Lamar that the Mexican presence had given an impulse to everything there. Now, these sentiments may sound strange, especially when we recall that 4 years earlier, Mexicans were widely hated because of the massacres at the Alamo and Goliad, which occurred nearby. For political and military reasons, Lamar and his government had to exercise restraint. The Federalist movement was welcome because it distracted the Mexican government from its goal of taking back its former province. But Lamar did not wish to alienate the centralist authorities in Mexico City or his British allies at a time when he was trying to obtain recognition for Texas independence. The Texans who accepted the call to fight with the Federalists did not share those restraints. Many were in favor of a new republic made up of the northern Mexican states, or they shared the Federalist sentiments of the rebels. Some went along for the adventure. Many others participated because they were promised money and land, which was appealing to many young Texans looking for opportunities after the Panic of 1837. This allowed Canales to recruit a force of about 300 Texans, including Reuben Ross and 75 Rangers who had fought against the Indians. William Fisher, who had been Sam Houston's Secretary of War, joined the movement with about 200 men, and Juan Seguin with about 100 Mexican Texans also enlisted. Even Samuel Jordan, who had deserted earlier, returned to help lead the Texan contingent. The Federalists had hoped to recruit about 1,500 Texans, but they did not even come close to that number. The total fighting force, including Mexicans, Texans, and Carrizo Indians, was about 1,000, and they were no match for a centralist army, which had recently beaten back a half-hearted French invasion and which was now ready to turn its attention to the border region. By the middle of 1840, Arista had most of the region under centralist control and was combating isolated pockets of resistance. The fear of failure provoked dissension among the Federalists, and especially between the Texans and the Mexican leaders of the movement. Arista used this to drive a wedge between the Federalist leaders and the Texans, and he finally gained the capitulation of Canales and his forces. Although the Federalist movement went down to defeat, it had benefits for some. For Texas, it gained an interval of peace. For the political leaders of Tamaulipas, it meant a recovery of their positions of power that they had lost during the centralist regime. The Mexican government had to negotiate with regional elites like those of Tamaulipas because Texas independence had given Canales and other leaders a sword to blandish against their own government. Their objective was not to form another republic like Texas, but to have a greater leverage and power within the Mexican Federation. We can conclude that there was a genuine spirit of federalism among many of the Mexican borderlanders, but it is also true that federalism masked deeper economic, personal, and political interests. The examples are legion. James Grant's project for a republic in northern Mexico to further British objectives, the slave interests of many Texas settlers, Zavala's, Mejia's, and Carvajal's interests in Texas land, the economic motives of the New Orleans merchants, the desire for plunder of the Texas adventurers who joined Canales during the Federalist Wars, and the political and economic interests of Mexico's northeastern elites. The economic wellsprings behind federalism would be even more evident in the commercial bonds that developed between Anglos and Mexicans in the border region. Commerce was a crucial part of the colonization of Texas. Stephen Austin was convinced that the trade of Santa Fe and Chihuahua could be better served by the ports of Texas, as it would be much closer to Chihuahua than Missouri. And he also knew that Mexican markets were the best for Texas products. He gave an example: a fanega of corn, which is about 55 liters, could be sold in Mexican markets for between 4 and 6 times more than in New Orleans. But the strongest attraction of the Mexican trade was silver from the mines of northern Mexico. The scarcity of silver in Texas and the U.S. Southwest made this a highly valued commodity, which was required for all types of transactions. Through Santa Fe and later through Matamoros and the ports of Texas, a stream of silver flowed from the mines of Chihuahua and Zacatecas and was conveyed in the crude transport of the period to the United States. We could paraphrase Homer and say that these were the mines that launched 1,000 wagons. The Mexican trade was a powerful magnet, pulling toward it many Yankee and European merchants like Charles Stillman and José San Román, who gravitated to the region of the lower Rio Bravo, especially after the opening of Matamoros as a port in the early 1820s. These merchants had the same goal as the land speculators: to make a fortune. The area in which they chose to settle and do business became a sort of a middle ground between Anglos and Mexicans during the first half of the 19th century. Matamoros was one of 7 towns along the Rio Grande called the Villas del Norte, which also included Reynosa, Camargo, Mier, Revilla, Dolores, and Laredo. Their great distance from the center of power in Mexico City and their proximity to Texas and its commerce conditioned the way in which the vecinos, or residents of the villas, identified themselves between regional and national loyalties. And this, of course, would be crucial in defining their attitude toward the growing Anglo presence in the region. Geography and climate made the Mexican Northeast ideal for stock raising, and this became the principal economic activity. The Villas del Norte exported salt, livestock, and hides, while importing corn and foodstuff. The annual income from cattle and other livestock was close to 2/3 of the total revenue for the province. But this commerce ran into a stone wall. The central government banned some products and placed high tariffs on others, and this drove the residents of the villas to resort to smuggling on a massive scale. The illicit trade brought together Mexican nationals and foreigners. Some of those foreigners began to establish roots in Matamoros among the Mexican population and even to marry into prominent Mexican families. The Mexicans who participated in the contraband trade included muleteers and cartmen, as well as landowners who cooperated with the smugglers by hiding the contraband on their ranches. Many government officials were involved or chose to look away. So both as participants or consumers, most members of society were involved, and smuggling became quite an accepted occupation. Through actions like these, Mexicans of the Northeast were pulling away from the centrifugal force of the national government and gravitating toward the irresistible pull of the American economic orbit. This movement had begun during the late colonial period, and it accelerated after Mexican independence. This process redirected traditional trade routes toward the north through Matamoros and its connections with Texas ports and New Orleans. But it also reconnected them toward the interior routes, which connected towns of northeast Mexico with San Antonio, the most populous commercial center of Texas, and the Villas del Norte served as intermediate points for this trade. As military commander of the northern provinces in 1827, Anastasio Bustamante provided military escort to the merchants from Coahuila, Nuevo León, and the river settlements who transported their goods in convoys that left Laredo 3 times a year on their way to Béjar. David Weber has written that by the 1840s, the region had become dependent on the United States for markets and merchandise, just as in another time it had depended on the center of New Spain. But the Noristenses, or the residents of the Northeast, drifted further away from the national mainstream for another reason. They were increasingly alienated from the central government, not only because of its commercial policies, but also due to its actions during the War for Texas independence. The Noristenses were sorely afflicted during the war because of the militarization of the border region and the harsh demands placed upon them by the national government and its advancing army. They were ordered to provide men, transport animals, provisions, and money. Oftentimes, the army simply ransacked towns and haciendas. The division commanded by General Joaquin Ramirez y Sesma was brutal toward the population. As it crossed through Nuevo León on its way to Texas, it took what it wanted and committed so many outrages that it was likened to a plague of locusts. The demands of the Texas campaign provoked economic hardship on the population as oxen, mules, and horses that were needed for agricultural production, but also for commerce, were taken by the army. The increase of Indian depredations during and after the Texas Revolution was perhaps the reality which most afflicted the Noristenses. At the same time, in fact, in the very same moment that the army of Sam Houston was rushing across the fields of San Jacinto, some 300 Indian marauders were galloping through the ranches of the Rio Grande, leaving a trail of death and desolation. Santa Anna became aware of this. The problem in dramatic fashion was posed to him as he passed through Laredo on his way to San Antonio. City leaders explained to the general that the threat of Indian attack had become a frightening reality because the garrison was pulled away to fight the rebels in Texas. 26 persons had been killed during the previous 12 months and more than 1,000 head of cattle stolen. According to Gilberto Hinojosa, Santa Anna neither replied to their requests for nor sent reinforcements. This incident placed the priorities of the people of the border region and those of the national government in stark relief. To the vecinos, hunger and Indian raids were an ever-present danger, while the Texas rebels were only an abstract threat. The callous indifference of the national government made them realize that they would have to look out for themselves. The events of 1835-1836 forced the vecinos to adopt a more independent attitude toward the central government. Moreover, the struggle for survival in a harsh environment and the pursuit of their local interests led them to explore various forms of accommodation with the Texans and their newly gained independence. Now, race and nationalism were two potential obstacles to this cooperation, but they're kind of complex, and I don't have time to deal with them now, but if you'd like, during the question and answer session, we can discuss them. But despite the hostility and conflict between Texas and Mexico, during the years of the Texas Republic, many Mexicans continued to trade with their Texan neighbors as they had done before the separation of Texas. Commerce was the bridge between Anglos and Mexicans, forging a commonality of interests in the border region, but it was, of course, unacceptable to the Mexican government. With a state of war existing against the rebel republic, it was natural that the government would prohibit trade with Texas and punish those who disobeyed. Army and civil authorities issued numerous decrees against trade with the Texans, like the broadside by Mariano Arista in April 1841, which inveighed against the scandalous commerce that the vecinos were carrying out with the Texans, and it warned offenders that if caught, not only would all of their property be confiscated, but they would be put in the Army to serve for 10 years. After citizens of Laredo ignored the military's threats and went to Texas to trade their cattle for badly needed goods, the local military chief accused them of treason because their commerce was an implicit acceptance of Texas independence. Faced with these threats, the Norestenses took refuge in the contraband trade. According to Joseph Wilkinson, over 15,000 Mexicans operating along the river and as far south as San Luis Potosí were engaged in smuggling. The illegal trade was almost universal and included citizens high and low on the social scale. Lucinda Grigui of Monterrey was accused of trafficking with the Texans, and this caused a public scandal because she was the concubine of Adrian Wall, one of the Mexican military commanders in charge of combating the Texans. Wall was accused of providing troops and an escort for the lady so that she could evade the fiscal authorities. Even the local military units were suspected of trading with the enemy. In mid-1844, the authorities in Reynosa put a stop to the patrols of the local militia against Indian raiders because they felt that the soldiers involved in these patrols would also engage in smuggling. Now, trade was a hazardous enterprise during those times. The traders and freighters who moved the goods through the border region faced great obstacles. Indians who made forays along the Rio Grande were a major menace. Anglo and Mexican predators roamed over the land on both sides of the border, attacking the commercial caravans. Sometimes the freighters were robbed of everything and left to return on foot to their place of origin. Other times, they were simply killed. But despite these dangers, the trade persisted because it satisfied an essential need. This truth was discovered by General Hansbrough Bell, who was sent by President Lamar in 1841 to investigate conditions on the frontier. He reported that a part of the Anglo population was opposed to the trade, but the majority of it supported the trade because they could obtain needed articles which they could not obtain otherwise. Now, just what were those goods? Newspaper reports indicate that wagons loaded with beans, sugar, flour, leather, shoes, saddles, and silver bars continued to cross the prairies to be exchanged for calico, tobacco, and manufactured hardware. A Houston newspaper reported in 1839 that silver in large quantities was arriving in Béjar from Chihuahua. One trader arrived with $17,000 in specie, and it was estimated that goods valued up to $150,000 could be sold immediately at Béjar for specie or bullion. For various reasons, trade through Matamoros declined between 1835 and 1845. But what was lost through that port was compensated by new interior routes that developed throughout the period. Products from Coahuila, Nuevo León, and Tamaulipas would reach the Rio Grande at various points, such as Laredo and Camargo, and proceed inland to Béjar, Matagorda, Goliad, Victoria, and even as far as Houston and Austin. During the Federalist Wars, traders from the Northeast in large numbers began to enter Texas, and according to Dr. Ellsbury of San Antonio, they considered that they had something in common with the Texans since they had almost unanimously espoused federalism. Not only were there no longer reasons to make war, but they could join together in fighting the Indian menace. In the words of Ellsbury, they wished to make common cause with our citizens against the savages. President Lamar issued a proclamation in February 1839 to open trade with the Mexicans. The measure enjoined military and civil authorities to afford all proper aid and protection to peaceful citizens of Mexico who arrived in Texas to exchange their goods. After less than a year, Lamar reported that notable progress had been made and that several thousand horses were introduced into Texas to supply domestic and military needs. In June 1841, Lamar sent 2 emissaries to see Arista in Monterrey. The purpose of the mission was to reach an agreement on ending the warfare in the border region, but also to establish a safe and friendly commerce between Texas and northeast Mexico. As the commissioners got closer to Monterrey, they reported that the Mexican population was, in their words, anxiously praying for peace and the reopening of a safe and direct trade with Texas. The Texas government was not alone in promoting trade. Many citizens were also in favor. When General Hansbrough Bell made his inspection of the frontier, he found that most Texans had developed a dependence on commerce with Mexico. He wrote, "Most of them ride Spanish horses and mules with Spanish saddles. They wear Mexican blankets, and it is not unusual to see and handle Mexican plata, all procured in the way of trade." The views expressed by Bell are substantiated by the experiences of various Texans who left testimony of their ties to the Mexican trade. Henry Clay Davis came to Texas as a young man in the late 1830s and settled in San Antonio. He accepted the invitation of a Mexican friend from Camargo to visit his home. And while in that town, he met and fell in love with Hilaria Garza. That's Hillary Garza. In order to gain her parents' permission to marry Hilaria, he agreed to settle on the northern side of the river so that they could see her often. And so he established a ranch there, and that's how Rio Grande City was born. And he established his family there and built a life among the Mexican population, like so many others that we know little about. Now, many Anglos shared the conviction that they could engage the Mexicans in a pursuit that would be mutually beneficial. That was the thinking of Henry Connolly, who received his medical degree in Kentucky and ventured to Chihuahua, where he became a merchant and freighter. He thought of a plan, like Austin, to channel the Chihuahua trade through Texas, and in 1839, he and 2 other merchants obtained 7 wagons. They contracted also about 100 guards, 50 of whom were Mexicanos, and 700 mules to carry silver to the United States and to return with manufactured goods. Now, Connolly obtained permission from the Chihuahua government, and he would pass through Presidio del Norte, which was not an authorized port of entry. So bribes would have to be paid to the authorities. Now, when Connolly returned, he was at the head of 60 to 80 wagons and about 200 people, including a circus. But he ran into bad luck. A new governor in Chihuahua impounded the goods until the appropriate duties were paid, making the venture unprofitable. Now, this occurred in 1840, 1841, and just let me remind you that a state of war existed between Mexico and Texas, which means that a lot of people joined Connolly and ventured into a territory of a nation whose army was sworn to combat the Anglo presence. Now, this was either the triumph of hope over reality or a sober assessment that things were not that bad and could be worked out to the satisfaction and mutual benefit of everyone concerned. Moreover, the fact that the venture failed does not alter a reality in which cooperation for profit was the goal, and it could be established between people of different races. William Neal was another borderlander who had no qualms about dealing with Mexicans. A native of England who became a U.S. citizen, he established a stage line to carry goods between Matamoros and the coast. His son, Peter, was baptized in the Catholic Church, and his godfather was no less than Pedro de Ampudia, one of Santa Anna's most trusted generals and a fervent enemy of the Texas government. Neal placed his wagons at Ampudia's disposal when the beaten general was removing wounded soldiers from the battlefield at Palo Alto at the beginning of the U.S.-Mexican War. Ampudia returned the favor in 1855 when Neal asked him to liberate a fellow merchant, Henry Kinney, who was his captive. Neal had a checkered career. He was U.S. consul in Matamoros. He was the mayor of Brownsville on 2 occasions. He served the Confederacy during the Civil War. And his ranch at Santa Maria Ranch was attacked by Juan Cortina in 1859 during the Cortina War. In that struggle, his son was killed, but despite this crushing blow, Neal stayed in the region, and his store at Santa Maria on the Rio Grande was an important meeting place for Anglos, Mexicans, and Indians for many years. One final case exemplifies the breed of men who were willing to deal with Mexicans in hopes of making a good living or even a fortune. Henry Lawrence Kinney, a native of Pennsylvania, who was engaged in land speculation in Illinois when he was cleaned out by the Panic of 1837, he drifted to Texas. He and William Aubrey opened a trading post next to the Nueces River and began an illegal trade with Mexico. And Kinney later bought out Aubrey and found the city of Corpus Christi. Kinney's experience reflects a willingness to subordinate national, ethnic, and racial prejudices and to adopt a pragmatic attitude necessary to survive in a hostile environment. His philosophy involved getting along with everyone, including the enemy. Thus he declared, "When Mr. Mexican came, I treated him with a great deal of politeness, particularly if he had me in his power. When Mr. American came, I did the same with him, and when Mr. Indian came, I was also very frequently disposed to make a compromise with him." Smart man. Each time men like Kinney, Davis, Neal, and Connolly made a trade, they were constructing a bridge between the two peoples of the borderlands. David Weber once wrote that economic interests often forged agreements between Anglos and Hispanics during the Spanish period. This was also true in the Mexican period, but in fact, the economic interests reflected in trade relations often went beyond agreements and led to peaceful and even amicable relations. Only a year after the war for Texas independence, the Telegraph and Texas Register of Houston reported that business and conditions in San Antonio were rapidly improving as a result of the many traders arriving from the Rio Grande. The traders were patient and friendly, and according to the paper, they showed that they were desirous to renew their former intimate connections with our citizens. There was a cheering prospect that a friendly intercourse would eventually pave the way for a lasting peace. It was because of this trade that Joseph Wilkinson states that in spite of Santa Ana and the firebrands of Texas, an amicable relationship developed between individuals of the two countries that persisted right up to the U.S. war with Mexico. Stanley Green, who has studied extensively the correspondence of the Villas del Norte, asserts that the connection with Texas was much closer than has been known up to now. Octavio Herrera of Tamaulipas has discovered many documents which reveal this cooperation. Even in the state of war that existed during the Texas Republic, one document reveals that in the ranches and settlements of Reynosa, the Texans were being received in a friendly manner. One of the men in charge of combating the illegal trade across the Rio Grande, Colonel Francisco Gonzalez Pavon, wrote in 1838 that trade relations were creating sympathies which might lead the vecinos to reveal military secrets to the Texans. Another official, Jose Antonio Sanchez, wrote that the vecinos were in collusion with the Texans who give them tobacco and clothing and the hope of living without God and without government. Well, with that kind of government, who could blame them? Huh? The worst fears of the Mexican government were realized when a bigger enemy appeared on the horizon, Zachary Taylor arrived in Corpus Christi in September 1845 in preparation for the United States invasion of Mexico. His army needed provisions, horses, and mules. Some of these were obtained in the Villas del Norte. Merchants like Henry Kinney and Henry Clay Davis, who knew the terrain, became suppliers, and they relied on their contacts on the Rio Grande to obtain what the army needed. General Francisco Mejia of the Northern Army of Mexico was apoplectic with rage, and he ordered that merchants like Davis be captured. The prefect of the district reported that by December 1845, some of the vecinos had traded 3,000 head of cattle in Corpus Christi. So they had arrived there in September, and by December, they already had several thousand head of cattle from Mexico. As can be seen, despite the conflict between the two governments and the hardships and deadly obstacles, the trade between Anglos and Mexicans continued because it was an essential component to survival in the border region. When the Mexican government tried to stop it or made it prohibitive, the people of the border region resorted to smuggling. When one route closed, another opened. Commerce between northeast Mexico and Texas was like a flowing stream. When it was temporarily halted by some obstruction, it would renew its flow through another route. The flow was unstoppable in spite of difficulties and proscriptions. And through commerce, Anglos and Mexicans found a common ground for peaceful coexistence and, at times, friendly cooperation. Our findings indicate that Anglos and Mexicans of the border region were brought together by a commonality of interest which promoted cooperation even in a period of intense conflict. Members of the two races defied the logic of violence to establish bonds of collaboration in diverse areas such as land speculation, the defense of federalism, and commerce. Trade became the major field for cooperation in the Texas-Mexico borderlands. The increasing alienation of the Norestenses with their government and the powerful pull of the American market created conditions for cooperation between Anglos and Mexicans of the border region. Whether the issue is land speculation or the defense of federalism or transborder trade, none of the actors, Anglo or Mexican, involved in these various interactions displayed deep philosophical or ideological principles. In their relations and interactions, they were guided by what we are guided by, self-interest. They also had a pragmatic spirit which allowed them to defy racial and nationalist conventions in order to seek a common ground for mutual coexistence and cooperation. And finally, the border region, the contact zone between the two races, provided many opportunities and situations that obligated Anglos and Mexicans to make compromises. Over time, this cooperation, even when fueled by self-interest, often evolved into mutual respect and cultural acculturation, with many instances of friendship and even marriage. And all of this occurred even in the midst of unremitting violence, kind of like a flower growing in the desert. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. You're very kind.
That was a fascinating story, and it ought to remind us, especially those of us who teach history, that when we see those colors on the map and we see those borders drawn and we read about those wars going on, that we need to keep our nose in the documents where Miguel's has been in the past few years, looking at what's actually going on the ground. Because the closer you get down to the ground, the more you see those little, they may look like ants from this distance, but the more you see those people going back and forth and trying to stop ants getting in your house is tough, as I've found out this rainy spring in Raleigh, and that's what it reminds me of. We're going to take a break. I'm going to exercise my prerogative to give this many people the full 15 minutes. So we will meet and promptly begin again at 11:20. If you have questions for Dr. Gonzalez Quiroga, in order to give him a chance to answer more fully, we'll wait until the question and answer session for those. So we'll see you back here in 15 minutes.
Thanks, sir.
I don't guess it would be telling tales out of school to say that we really began, at least I really began, and I pushed my colleagues to think about it in this way too, really began thinking about this symposium, this 8th symposium, and our theme after I became aware of Stuart Reed's book, The Secret War for Texas. Seeing Texas from this distant horizon, seeing the Texas Revolution from the point of view of a man who was arguably a conscious British agent, having followed Houston recently, and I was so grateful when I reread something I had written about Houston and Grant and their trading elbows down on the Rio Grande during that black hole of the Texas Revolution between the fall of Bear and the siege of the Alamo. In other words, late December, January, February, when nothing seems to be happening, but where the fate of Texas is being decided by this American agent, Sam Houston. No apologies for that description. By a conscious American agent, Sam Houston. And what is very likely this conscious British agent, James Grant, as they are trying each to take the Texas Revolution and the Civil War that's going on in Mexico and turn it their direction, turn it in the direction of their country. And during the Q&A session, Stuart or I or anyone else can tell you why we think what we do about this. But this is a story that's very little told, and I heaved a sigh of relief after I went back and read some of my own work, and after I had finished Stuart's and said, okay, I didn't say anything really stupid about Dr. Grant and his conflict with Houston. It all makes a lot more sense now, however, after having read Stuart's account of what's going on down there. Stuart Reed is a man of many talents. I understand you're the artist who did that drawing on the front of your book. A surveyor, a cartographer, a military historian. We are so fortunate that we did not collide with Culloden any more than we did. He was at that historic battle site all day Wednesday in Scotland, where he was very much involved in the commemoration and dedication of the renovations that they've done and the reinterpretation of the Battle of Culloden, the last really major military battle on the island of Britain. He then flew all day Thursday, hours and hours and hours, so that he could be here to go to San Jacinto with us yesterday, and then to be here to talk to you today. We've had a pretty good track record of contracting with people to come and speak to us before they win their prizes, and as you'll find out later, that's exactly what happened with Stuart Reed. So let me, without talking anymore, now that everyone's back, introduce to you the fascinating and eloquent prize-winning historian and self-taught historian of Texas, virtually from scratch, in order to understand his great-great-great-grandfather, Stuart Reed.
Thank you. I'll just expand a little bit on that introduction, just to explain to you where I come from in this story, why I've come all the way across the Atlantic to talk about a major figure of the Texan Revolution. I'm a military historian. My chief interest lies in the 18th century, the battlefield of Culloden, and the British Army exploits after that period. By way of light recreation, for lack of a better word, I also got involved in a bit of family history and discovered this Dr. James Grant, who inexplicably, so far as the family was concerned, disappeared off the face of the earth in 1820. Completely vanished, no mention of him whatsoever, other than the fact that there was a family mystery. I was told he was a family mystery, but it was such a mystery that nobody knew what the mystery was. Only that it existed. And then, by sheer chance, through a flukish set of circumstances which I won't bore you with, a newspaper cutting turned up from Australia, which told that he had been killed in Mexico in something, and there was a very frustrating tear in the newspaper to deal with a revolution and a guy called Edwards. In approximately 12 hours, I'd come across Hayden Edwards, the Fredonian Rebellion, and remembered from long, long ago that in the 1820s, Texas wasn't part of the United States, Texas was part of Mexico. And that he hadn't died in Mexico as we understand it now, but in the United States, in Texas. So from there, it was quite easy to move on to histories of the Texan Revolution, and it turns out to be a villain. It's all his fault. The Alamo fell because he took all those men away from it, he took all that ammunition away from it, he took all that supplies away from it to go off to Matamoros in search of loot and everything else. Well, that didn't bother me. A wicked old granddaddy, always far more interesting than one who just ploughed the field and scattered, went to church on Sunday and helped little old ladies across the road. It was great. I didn't mind that, but what did upset me, and this is where the teachers might like to come in on this, was the fact he was dismissed in just a line. That he was the guy who went off to Matamoros. He was a major figure, a pivotal character in the Texan Revolution, and yet nobody had done anything about him, other than to dismiss him as the guy whose fault it all was. So I went into it. I dug into it. And he still turns out to be a bit of a villain. In fact, when the manuscript for Sixth War for Texas was read by Craig Rowell of Georgia Southern, he produced two comments on it. He produced an official comment which appears in the back of the dust jacket, and an unofficial comment which he communicated to me privately. He said, "This would make a great film. And if it's ever made as a film, James Grant is going to be played by Johnny Depp as Captain Jack Sparrow." But in approaching the story, in getting into the story, getting behind that one-line dismissal that he was the bad guy, I had an advantage in that he was family. Because he was family, I knew who he was, and that eventually led me on to what he was. Now, the who he was, which is where I've got my special insight, is he was the cousin of the British Colonial Secretary. This was a guy who had first-class contact with the British government. Not just some minor official, but to the very top of the British establishment. So what was he doing in Texas? Why was did he suddenly disappear from British history, so to speak, and turn up obscurely in Texas, so obscurely that he only merits this one line, this single inaccurate paragraph in the Handbook of Texas? Why? Well, Manuel answered that pretty well in his own speech. Commerce. Britain was desperately interested in Mexico. Not just in Mexico, but in the whole Caribbean basin, and it was worried about what was happening in the United States. It's easy sometimes here at the outset of the 21st century to look at America as this great republic stretching from sea to shining sea. But in the 1820s, it didn't. In the 1820s, the United States was still slowly moving westward from the original 13 colonies. It was expanding, but it was still very substantially on the east bank of the Mississippi. The West, although a huge chunk of it had been bought in the Louisiana Purchase, was still empty land. It still didn't exist. And the republic itself was new. In 1836, when the Battle of the Alamo was fought, there were still men alive who had fought at Bunker Hill. The United States was that new, so there was nothing at all inherently, there was no inevitability at this stage that Texas, far less California, would become American. The British were determined to stop it from becoming American. And the reason was commerce, pure and simple. The British Empire, as it later became, never started off as empire. It was an accidental empire. We gained possessions in India and beyond through the East India Company, which is a trading corporation. It was the biggest, the biggest, arguably the most successful multinational trading corporation in the world. In the West, we had huge interests in the Caribbean. The Caribbean sugar trade and the associated spin-offs, indigo, coffee, and all the rest of it, a major part of the British economy. The British won the Napoleonic Wars because of the money they had from the West India trade and the East India trade. Both of them, in the 1820s, were seen to be threatened by American expansion. Immediately it was threatened in the Caribbean because the Americans appeared to be taking over. At the outset of the period, Florida is still Spanish. Florida is taken over by the Americans. There is this movement westwards, spurred on by the purchase of New Orleans and theoretically the lands beyond. The Americans insisted that Texas had come to them as part of the Louisiana Purchase. The Spanish government disagreed. The Mexican government, which succeeded, it also disagreed, and this is where the settlement of Texas comes in, because a tremendously unstable period in the 1810s, 1820s, stabilized it with competing interests, which had led to catastrophic collapse of the Mexican Tejano community in Texas. They'd been wiped out by Spanish armies, American filibusters, general civil war, and the appearance of the Comanche, preying on this disorganized, demoralized community. So restocking, repopulating Texas was a major priority, first for the Spanish government and the Mexican government which followed. Famously, this was started off by Moses Austin and Stephen Austin coming after him. That wasn't how the Mexican government and the Spanish government before them had planned it. They wanted Texas populated by European settlers. They didn't want Americans. Stephen Austin promised he would bring in Europeans, and he double-crossed his partner, Arthur Goodall Wavell, who'd gone to England to raise the capital and organise the settlers there. He just cut him off. He brought in his American settlers, more American impresarios followed, and far from creating a barrier to American expansion, Texas was becoming, if you like, the plug hole. It was drawing in the Americans, which was the last thing that the Mexicans wanted. It was also the last thing that the British wanted. They were looking at the maps. Florida had gone. There was uncomfortable interest being openly expressed in America in the island of Cuba. If Cuba went, that was it. The Caribbean basin had gone. It was strongly hinted to the US government, any attempt to invade Cuba, any attempt to filibuster Cuba would be strongly resisted by Britain, by France, by Spain. That was out. But movement along the Gulf Coast, that also had to be stopped. And this is where Britain came in again. Immediately to protect the Caribbean, but also looking towards India. Because at this period, the only way to India was down through the South Atlantic, round the Cape of Good Hope of South Africa, up to India, and out to China that way. We had a succession of way stations. That was a well-travelled route, well-policed by the Royal Navy and the East India Company's own forces. America at this stage was not a threat to the Indian-Chinese trade. But get the Americans to California, it's 6 weeks sail across the Pacific, different matter entirely. So for purely commercial reasons rather than political reasons, we were not keen to see America moving westwards the Mississippi. And so, as they say, the adventure began. Right from the beginning, British agents, British diplomats in Mexico are working against American expansion. The big priority was to create this barrier. Texas, because it's been so depopulated, was merged in the new federal constitution of 1824 with Korea. The government of Korea were the people who primarily were charged with giving out these land grants, these impresario grants. But the Mexican government had a total ban on any land grants in the border area. Anything in semi-disputed area across the Sabine, the Korea government was not allowed to make any land grants there. Any land grants there were province entirely of the central government. And so the British tried to get their own plantations there through Arthur Wavell, who had been double-crossed by Austin earlier. The Cherokees came into it, John Dunn Hunter. So there was this plan to set up a series of impresario grants along the Sabine up the Red River, which would form a barrier between the Mexican grants, which were given to Austin and the others, and the United States itself. And which is where the Fredonian business came in, because that in itself was not a British idea, but it's one that we latched onto. We encouraged the Edwards. We encouraged them with promises of British support. And this is where Grant, who'd already been in the area for some time now, always finding excuses why he wasn't going to settle in Texas. I'm coming, well, actually, I'm a bit busy. I'll come next year. But he's building up contacts all over the southern part of Texas, the trade routes along the Camino Real. He's got that figured, because the one thing which is obsessing Britain at this time are the silver mines in northern Mexico. For the moment, we want to stop the Americans moving over, but we also want to make sure that this silver trade, which Miguel has been talking about, was not diverted up the Camino Real through Bejar and on to the United States. We wanted it coming out through the ports, through Tampico, into the Caribbean. We wanted not necessarily to corner the trade, we just didn't want the Americans cornering the trade. And so it was important to set up this barrier to an easy commerce between the United States and Mexico through Texas. And so James Grant turns up in Texas once again during this period. We've got British diplomat Henry Ward, who was a British spy master in the area at the time, decides he's going to take this casual visit to view the silver mines. And suddenly, for some strange reason, which he never reveals in his official correspondence or in his later book, Mexico in 1827, just as he's floating about in what is now the border of the Rio Grande area, the Fredonian Rebellion starts. He's got nothing to do, he doesn't even mention it. He mentions a coup, attempted coup in Mexico City. The rebellion, Fredonian Rebellion around Nacogdoches, not a whisper. James Grant's there. He's referred to by one of the colonists who is trying to find out for Austin what's going on. Well, Wavell and Hunter promising British support. And there's this Dr. Somebody in the area who speaks French, he speaks Spanish. He's promising British support again. This is what it's all about. It's nothing to do with the Edwards. It's the British are doing it. And it collapses. We didn't get there in time. We didn't get those 500 men landed at the mouth of the Brazos, which had been promised. And Grant disappears from Texas history. Up until that point, he's in every year, he's in twice a year, trading, talking, and suddenly it goes quiet. He goes back to northern Mexico. He establishes himself in Coahuila. He becomes a man of business. And he becomes deeply involved in Mexican politics, in Federalist politics. Up until that point, there is no doubt he is working as a British agent. After that point, his priorities change. It's a bit like the old rule of thumb with diplomats. I can't remember the exact figure, but it's generally reckoned that an ambassador to a particular country is only good for 3 years. For those 3 years, he will represent his country honestly to the government of that country, of the country he is credited as an ambassador. After 3 years, he starts taking the side of that country against his own. He spends more time explaining, excusing why that country is acting as it does, instead of laying down the law saying, no, you mustn't do that, that's the way we want, we object to you taking this policy. Instead, he's explaining that policy to his own government. By the 1830s, Grant has definitely moved into the Mexican side of things. He is talking as a Mexican federalist. His input into the Texan Revolution is as a Mexican federalist. Now, as an added bonus, what he's planning to do, what he's involved in, will still achieve that original aim of blocking the American expansion into Texas. But that is now a secondary aim in his primary aim, which is that of setting up the Republic of Rio Grande 5 years before Canales and the rest actually got going on that themselves. Miguel spoke earlier of the Tampico expedition. That was not isolated. It was part of a coordinated attempt to raise the northern Mexican states, of which Texas was only a part. There is a letter from George Fisher, who was actually a Serbian called George Fisher, who was prominent in Federalist politics. He became part of the group in New Orleans. And he set out the plan clearly in a letter to Austin. So what's going to happen is Grant has been arrested, not to do with land speculation, nothing like that, but because he was acting secretary of the Coahuila legislature. He's fought in Zacatecas against Santa Ana. He commanded the Coahuila militia against General Corse. And when that all collapsed, he and Vizca were arrested, taken to Monterrey. The plan, as the Texans revolted and started to lay siege to Bejar, was that Mejia would land at Tampico or Matamoros, whichever he found convenient. It turned out to be Tampico, but that's neither here nor there. At the same time, Grant was going to be sprung from Monterrey and brought back with Mejia, with Vizca, to form a new administration in Bejar. It was all part of one coherent plan. Ben Milam got involved in this too. He was the canary, so to speak. He was allowed to escape from Monterrey, where he was held with Grant and Vizca, Cameron and various others, for two reasons. One, to check that the route was clear, and two, to create the impression that Monterrey was no longer secure. He made his famous escape, aided, it's quite openly admitted by the authorities in Monterrey, and immediately, oh dear, we can't have this, Monterey is no longer secure. Let's move Grant and Vesca to San Juan Holoa down at Veracruz, the big island fortress. Let's lock them away there in the dungeon, toss away the key. That'll solve that one. Let's get on to the Texians. The trouble was, it was all a setup. Grant, Vesca, released from prison in Monterey, sent off with a military escort who went 10 miles down the road and changed sides. They said, no, we're not centralists, no, we're federalists. The important figure here was a Mexican colonel called Jose Maria Gonzalez. But quite coincidentally, it was the same name as the trumpeter who sounded the attack on the Alamo some months later, but they weren't related so far as I know. Colonel Gonzalez changed sides halfway down the road. They turned around and the whole lot ran for Texas. Unfortunately, the Tampico expedition had failed, but Vesca, who was the president of President Cohea, he got away, Grant got away, they got up to Texas and ran into trouble. Because the Texans, in particular Philip Dimmitt, were starting to look very suspiciously at the Mexicans. They were starting to think, we can do this on our own. What we want is an English-speaking republic, an American republic in Texas. We don't want to get involved in this Mexican civil war which is brewing there. We've seen Zacatecas worked over by Santa Anna. We've seen Coahuila worked over by Cos. We can't trust the Mexicans. They're not going to stand up. We're going to stand alone. Vesca goes off. He tries to enlist the support, gets nowhere. Grant doesn't bother. He goes straight up to Bejar and gets involved. He helps to take Bejar. There's a revealing passage in some years later. There's a guy called Ogilvie who was sent out by Grant's executors to try and recover a quite remarkable amount of money which went missing at this period, and some other things which we don't have time to talk about here. I can speak about it later. And he had a conversation with some of the guys who were involved in the storming of Bejar. And this story we have of Ben Milam striding out and saying, who will follow me, drawing a line in the sand, which sounds suspiciously like the same one that happened at the Alamo, saying, those who are going to follow me into Bejar, cross this line and let's go do it. What turns out was that Ben Milam was pushed out of the tent by James Grant, which is one of the reasons why Grant ended up as one of the co-leaders of the actual assault on Bejar. He got himself wounded. We don't know the circumstances. If anybody can ever turn up an account of how he got himself shot in the siege of Bejar, I will stand him a coffee, 2 coffees, and maybe even stand him breakfast and dinner combined. I would dearly love to know. But either way, Grant got wounded during the storming of Bejar, and this gave him a critical advantage later on because he had fought, he had bled in the cause. So when later he came up against Sam Houston, who was described as Grant's bitter enemy, Grant had that advantage because right up until the day of San Jacinto, Sam Houston never heard, nor far less fired a shot in anger in the defense of Texas. He was a general, but he didn't fight up until they got to San Jacinto. Grant, on the other hand, did, and he had the scars to prove it. Which is where we come to Matamoros. The accounts which I read when the first book where I found James Grant, and Steve Harden will smile at this because we were talking about that book earlier on this morning, was a book published by Osprey, which was published just in time for the sesquicentennial, Alamo and the Texas Revolution, and it was basically a primer. It had some nice pictures, it had some hilarious colour illustrations, which I'll tell you about later at some point, and it had this one line about how Grant had led a portion of the army off to Matamoros and disaster. Nothing more. That was it. It was great. I sat there in the Kentucky Fried Chicken reading, that's him. Wow. But that was all it said. And little more could I find other than that, that somehow, after taking Behar, the Texians had fallen out amongst themselves. The story developed a bit more from that, how the council had fallen out with the governor, and how each of them had commissioned different people to command, how there were 3, 4 different commanders for the Matamoros expedition, all of them in disagreement, and how eventually they'd ended up just casually stealing horses down beyond San Patricio until finally they got snapped up, and how much of a waste all of this had been. In actual fact, the Matamoros expedition had nothing whatsoever to do with taking Matamoros, with plundering Matamoros, or any of the other things which Houston later charged. Matamoros was only to be the trigger. Matamoros, once the Texians arrived, was to be the start of this great uprising in northern Mexico. Vital Fernandez, Canales, all those other Federalist leaders who Miguel talked about, they had pledged themselves that when the Texians arrived at Matamoros, they would rise up. Now, had this happened, the whole history of the Texan Revolution and American history would have changed, because nothing is certain in this life. Santa Anna may still have won. The revolution in northern Mexico may still have fizzled out as it did in the 1840s. On the other hand, the Republic of Rio Grande could have become a reality. There could have been this big Anglo-Mexican state encompassing a good third of the present-day United States. Not just Texas, but New Mexico, Arizona, California would all have been part of this great republic of northern Mexico. Think then about how the United States would have looked, how the Civil War would have panned out, how World War I, how World War II would have panned out with a smaller, more insular United States. And it could have happened. It didn't happen, but that's what it was all about. That's what Matamoros was all about. And it was sabotaged first by Houston and then by the Mexicans themselves. Houston didn't want the army going off. Houston wasn't interested in Behar. All the way through the initial stages of the Texan Revolution, he wanted the army pulled back beyond the Colorado. It seems clear, looking at the distribution of the population at the time, that what Houston was aiming for was an independent Texas ready for annexation by the United States, and this would come about more easily if it just included the departments of Brazos and Nacogdoches, the predominantly Anglo department. It could see that this would be easier to accomplish if you left off the Tejano-Behar department. He had almost paranoid objection to having anything to do with the Tejano side of it, with the Mexican side. Let's leave them to it. He wanted to pull back behind the Colorado. So going to Matamoros, whether he understood fully what Grant was trying to achieve, I don't know. I suspect he did. He wanted Matamoros stopped, not because it was diversion of resources. He did not want this Anglo-Mexican state to forestall the American expansion westwards. And so he tried to get it stopped. He was only partially successful. But nevertheless, and this is one of the things which is so easily overlooked in this, when we look at the popular history of the Texan Revolution, we think of the Alamo and the retreat, the runaway scrape to San Jacinto. How many people in this hall realize that Texian troops were actually raiding across the Rio Grande before that happened. Apart from those who read the book, would you stick your hand up if you knew that? If you knew that Texian troops were over the Rio Grande fighting there? It wasn't a passive thing. We were reaching out, or Grant was reaching out to his Federalist friends in northern Mexico, trying to get this. That's what the Matamoros expedition was about, and that was why, when the Matamoros expedition failed, that this breach occurred between the American side and the Mexican side. Texas became a republic for the next 10 years, an independent state in its own right. Britain supported that republic. We failed to tie Texas into the greater Republic of Northern Mexico, the Republic of Rio Grande. We hoped we could stop you getting hold of Texas as in the United States. We made a pretty good try at it. At one stage, the Texan minister in London was a British agent called William Kennedy. And you can't get much more infiltrated than that. But it's a fascinating story. And if you look beyond the walls of the Alamo, there's a huge, still untapped history of Texas waiting for you out there. And at that point, I'll wind up. But if you have any quick questions, deeper questions for later, I'll be pleased to speak. I don't mind.
We have about 5 minutes for a quick question for Stuart Reed. Yes, Dave.
What happened to Maria, Guadalupe, Reyes, and the children?
Let's repeat the questions.
He's asking what happened to Guadalupe Maria Reyes, who was Grant's common-law wife in Mexico. The short answer is I don't know. I would dearly love to know because there are a lot of my relatives down there in Mexico. Grant was a rich man. One of the criticisms levelled against him by Houston was that he was merely a land speculator. By any standards in those days, Grant was rich. He had extensive haciendas. His hacienda was a hacienda de los Hornos. He had iron smelting. He was vineyards, grain. He was a big businessman. He lost a lot by going to Texas. The land speculation was merely insurance against all this. There was a big fortune there which he tried to secure for Guadalupe Reyes. It was seized by the authorities, but what happened after that, I don't know. I would dearly love to know what happened to it and to the children.
The Matamoros expedition that you allude to, is that the same Matamoros expedition that James Fannin and his troops were going to embark upon?
Yeah,
they decided to pull back?
James Fannin was one of those who was going to go to Matamoros. One of the things I go into in the book in great detail, because it's not been properly looked at before, is the sequence of events and the sequence of command appointments on the Matamoros expedition. Grant was never officially in charge of the Matamoros expedition. Unofficially, he was the man who was leading it. The man appointed to lead the Matamoros expedition was Sam Houston. Sam Houston didn't want to do it. He ordered Jim Bowie to do it. Jim Bowie had moved back to Behar before the orders caught up with him. So Fannin was ordered to take command. Johnson, who was working with Grant, is sometimes cited as being ordered to take command, but he wasn't. All he was ordered to do was take command of the Behar contingent and march them to a rendezvous with Fannin and to act under Fannin's orders. The actual command sequence was straightforward. It just got screwed up by Houston and by later historians following Houston's cue, trying to take Smith's part in this dispute between the council and the president. But it's all the same expedition.
Was Sam Houston physically present with Fannin and Johnson and Grant, wherever that was, where they were making this?
The question is, was Sam Houston physically present down there with Grant and Fannin and the others?
Yes, but not with Fannin. Fannin was late in getting there. He had to assemble. There were large contingent of troops coming from the United States, which he had to pick up at Velasco and ship down the coast to Capano. The troops who marched overland from Behar were met at Goliad by Sam Houston. He marched with them as far as Refugio and there addressed them, trying to stop them going further. Fortuitously for him, Grant was absent. Grant had gone down south. I mentioned before about Colonel Jose Maria Gonzalez. Gonzalez was partially responsible for Cos' surrender at Behar, because Gonzalez was a Federalist, and he basically said to Cos men, come and join us. It's not what you've been told. It's not just these loud-mouthed Americanos. We are Federalists out here too. And in a quite incredible evening, a large part of Cos cavalry defected to Gonzalez. It was after this defection that Cos decided he had had enough. He could no longer rely on his troops because they were defecting to the Federalistas outside Behar, that he then surrendered. Gonzalez then went south with a composite regiment he'd put together, partly of his own men, partly of Federalistas like Benavidez, and partly of these men who'd defected from Cos. Grant went down to try and make contact with Gonzalez, who was floating about outside Matamoros with Canales, and while he was away, Houston tried to stop the army. He tried to get them to turn back, but the best he could manage was to get them to stop at Refugio to wait for Fannin, although a large contingent, upwards of 60, went off with Grant in the end. How many were actually involved is one of these interesting points. Someone spoke earlier about, Steve Harrigan mentioned earlier, this was good evidence of 250 defenders of the Alamo, whereas Houston and everyone taking a cue from him has mentioned this figure of 187, or occasionally 189 gets mentioned. There is a crucial and all too often overlooked reference by Houston to this 187. He refers to them as 187 white men. He ignores the Tejanos. There may well have been 250 defenders of the Alamo, but only 187 of them were white Americans. The same goes with the Grant expedition. We're frequently told in the standard version of history that when he was ambushed at Agua Dulce, he had only 26 men with him. Orea's account and some of the other Mexican accounts quite clearly state there were 60. The discrepancy is made up with Tejanos, with Federalist Mexicans, who have been written out of the story. It was a much bigger, much more integrated army than has been credited. Over the course of history since 1836, the Tejanos have been written out of the Mexican Revolution. We only hear about the Americans. We only hear about these 187, which in itself is an interesting thing, because if you look at the roll call for the Alamo, Amelia Williams' work and Bill Groneman's work after worked around this 189 or 187, and they included in those the known Tejanos. But if you take out those Tejanos, there are a number of vacancies to be filled. And I'm getting interesting hand signals, which I don't think are Masonic from Jim here, so I'll wind up there.
Yes.
If you want to ask anything further, fill out your yellow slips and we'll talk about some this afternoon.
It's going to take a great exercise of self-discipline on my part not to keep this going right now, because he's really getting good, and I want to talk about this stuff too. But please thank Stuart Reed. We'll have more of an opportunity to answer your questions. If you came in late, remember that at the end of our last after our final two speakers this afternoon, but before the question and answer session, if you will bring your yellow sheets with your questions and answers up to the podium, I will attempt to manage them and to channel your questions to these speakers, and we'll have all 5 people doing Q&A. Don't forget, if you need your book signed by Dr. Dimick, the new book on Filosola, he'll be around during the lunch break, but not in the afternoon. And if you want to get the autograph, do that. And at this point, I will ring the dinner bell.